Gary Okihiro is easily one of the most prominent historians in Asian American studies, so much so that it's a little embarrassing to enumerate his list of accomplishments. After he received his PhD in African history from UCLA, Gary taught at Humboldt State University, Santa Clara University, and Cornell before he occupied his current position at Columbia, where he is the director of the Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Race and a professor of international and public affairs. He is the author of 9 books on US and African history. 6 of these books have won prizes. My personal favorites are Margins and Mainstreams, Asians in American History and Culture, Common Ground, Reimagining American History, and The Columbia Guide to Asian American History. The last in this series, and I want to say it's his most recent, but I can't actually be sure if it's his most recent, he's so productive, is an amazing work of historiographical reflection, laying out systematically a comprehensive genealogy of where the field of Asian American history has been, and where some of its ongoing preoccupations may lead future researchers. For anyone interested in understanding the breadth and intellectual seriousness of the study of Asian American history, one could do no better than to consult the Columbia Guide first. Gary has also trained a cadre of historians, so that one feels his influence everywhere in academia. Many of his students now teach at institutions like Dartmouth, Yale, St. John's University, and the University of Washington at Seattle. And whenever one talks to these students or former students of his, one quickly gets a sense of how important Gary had been as their advisor. He has also acted as a mentor for countless historians and scholars in other disciplines over the years, and has done much, perhaps as much as anyone, to contribute to the enormous growth of Asian American studies as an intellectual field. Wherever programs have sprung up, in places like the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor, Northwestern, University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, Dartmouth, Texas at Austin, Maryland at College Park, NYU, and of course Columbia, Gary has been asked to provide his insights about institution building, social engagement, and scholarship. Given all of these accomplishments, there should be no surprise that Gary was recently honored with a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Association for Asian American Studies. So we're lucky today to host Gary on a very long day, discussing what we might do in American studies to grow institutionally and to remain sensitive to the many intellectual currents vivifying interdisciplinary study today. And second, because he's about to help us kick off the start of APAM here at BC. So please join me in welcoming Gary Okihiro.
Thanks very much, Min. Did my mic go off? Is okay? All right. It's a great delight and honor to be a part of your program for Asian Pacific American Heritage Month here at BC. I'd like to thank those responsible for my visit, especially the APAM committee and its co-coordinators, Romeo and Brian. Romeo also is the president of the Philippine Society here at BC, and he was especially helpful in assisting me with my booking and itinerary, for which I am grateful. Piecing together our history, I understand it, is your month's theme this year, and its sentiment is very appropriate for Asian Pacific Americans, particularly those of us who live and work east of California. When people, including Asians, say American, they commonly mean whites or blacks, almost never Asians. Asians, they say, are perpetual foreigners. No matter how many generations I've been in America, no matter how much I love apple pie and mom to boot, no matter how fervently I salute the flag and recite the Pledge of Allegiance, no matter what, someone will invariably ask me about my nationality, American, honest, where I came from, Canton, and that's in Ohio. And my, do you speak English well? You should hear my Tagalog. Asians in America, strangers we, foreigners, immigrants, invisible, hard to see. When the Golden Spike was driven home during celebrations in 1869, marking the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad at Promontory Point, Utah, a photograph was taken of the politicians, capitalists, and workers who claimed credit for the binding of this nation from sea to shining sea with a band of steel. It was all very masculine. I scanned the faces of the crowd in the picture, the smug faces, the jubilant faces, the caught unawares faces. I strained to see the faces of those recorded for posterity as the builders of this great republic. I searched in vain to locate a single Asian face among that conquering crowd, not a solitary Chinese laborer, 13,000 of whom had hauled dirt and stone, built raised beds, carried and pinned together track and tie, blasted granite mountains, sweated in the noonday desert sun, and shivered in snow piled so deep that it buried their piteous cabins, not a single Chinese American in the picture. How easy to forget. Indeed, Asians in America, strangers we, with a single swipe of history's hand, rendered ghosts, no footprints in the sand. Contemplating that photograph, I thought about another founding moment some 35 years ago at San Francisco State College, where students and faculty revolted over their discovery that entire peoples, entire communities had been virtually excluded from the halls of ivy, from the classrooms and courses and textbooks. We, Africans, American Indians, Asians, Latinos, women, gays, and lesbians, we want in, we demanded. We want in because of the American promise of equality, because of the American creed of democracy, because of the American dream of justice. We came to understand that our exclusion from education wasn't a mere happenstance or a quirk of fate or some airy ivory towerism that couldn't connect with people's lives. We came to understand that our irrelevance and exclusion, the exclusion of the masses who didn't hold and wield power and privilege, served to maintain those inequalities we saw as contrary to the American promise, the American creed, the American dream. Reconstituting America's past by restaging that 1869 picture at Promontory Point with a more inclusive cast of characters marks an advance in democracy's cause, for America was never a land peopled and built by white men only. We know that to be a simple deception. This land was cultivated by scores of native peoples, America's Indians, with diverse social organizations and cultures, by Europeans with a similar diversity, and Africans, Latinos, and Asians, likewise differentiated by a multitude of individual and collective identities. And among that varied racial and ethnic throng, there were men, assuredly, but also women, capitalists and workers, straights and gays. The lives and deeds of all of those people speak too loudly to be ignored. The sacrifices they bore, each one, too heavy to be left unattended. The causes for which they struggled, too worthy to lie in the dust. The legacy they bequeathed, too vital to be left behind. That past is before us, a reality that can never be denied or distorted by a picture, any picture, including that photograph taken at Promontory Point. After all, that is the main purpose of this Asian Pacific American Heritage Month, to remember those pasts and thereby reconfigure our destinies. Our history, you see, is an unqualified imperative for our America. As I've argued in my 1994 book mentioned by Min just a minute ago, Margins and Mainstreams, U.S. democracy is as importantly shaped at the margins as at the center. After 9/11, I am convinced of that more than ever. I remember being astonished by my dear friend, my esteemed constitutional scholar, committed civil libertarian, when he admitted sadly to me that he was so shaken in the days after 9/11 that he was willing to trade some civil liberties for his perceived personal safety. Of course, in the days, weeks, and months following 9/11 in the US, thousands of Arab and West Central and South Asian Americans reported instances of racial harassment and intimidation, including threatening gestures and speech, shootings, vandalizing of homes, businesses, and mosques. Whites attacked an Asian Indian and his white friend in San Francisco. Balbir Singh Sodhi, a Sikh, was killed in Mesa, Arizona in a hate crime, and Vakar Hassan, a Pakistani, was killed in Dallas. As two men beat Sikh American Surinder Singh Sidhu with metal poles in his Los Angeles store, they reportedly exulted, "We'll kill bin Laden today." Nervous crews and passengers removed dozens of Muslims and Sikhs and Arabs and Asians from flights, and dozens of students left colleges and universities. Hundreds of suspects, including immigrants generally, were summarily arrested, questioned, and detained. We must remember that during the campaign leading up to the 2004 elections, the Vice President hinted darkly that terrorism would more likely strike again if the opposing party gained political power. That drumbeat of fear has been a steady and effective theme for this regime and a means by which to silence dissent. As the Attorney General told Congress back in December 2001, those who scare peace-loving people with phantoms of lost liberty only aid terrorists. The Immigration and Naturalization Service, formerly under Justice and now under Homeland Security, has fingerprinted and photographed thousands of men from North Korea, Indonesia, Bangladesh, and Muslim countries in Central and West Asia and North Africa, and has detained hundreds. Those extraordinarily repressive actions were enabled under the guise of patriotism, the USA Patriot Act. The treatment accorded America's so-called enemies at home violate the fundamental rights and freedoms of all Americans, the freedoms of speech, assembly, religion, the press, and from fear and the due process of law, among others. And while those apparently immune from harassment and intimidation, from the choices of wearing a hijab or sari, of attending the mosque or gurdwara, or of assembling in groups or speaking Hindi, might willingly trade some of the freedoms of those along the margins of the US mainstream for their perceived personal safety, they sacrifice more than the rights of the dispossessed. And when those excluded from community membership fight to secure the freedoms denied them, they guarantee the rights and liberties of those who claim them as their birthright. To understand the US thus requires not only a focus on the mainstream, but also on the margins. As I put it in my 1994 book, and quoting oneself is the epitome of egotism, or indicative of having nothing new to say, although situating itself at the core, the mainstream is not the center that embraces and draws this diverse nation together. Although casting the periphery beyond the bounds of civility and religion, the mainstream derives its identity, its integrity, from its representation of its other. And despite its authorship of the central tenets of democracy, the mainstream has been silent on the publication of its creed. In fact, the margin has held the nation together with its expansive reach. The margin has tested and ensured the guarantees of citizenship, and the margin has been the true defender of American democracy, equality, and liberty. From that vantage, we can see the margin as the mainstream. You see, our history not only runs like a red thread through the entirety of the nation's past, but constitutes its very core. Despite the truth of that contention, celebrations of the nation's diversity easily devolves into displays of national dress, food, music, and dance, as if Cantonese takeout or sushi for the truly informed, meditation and yoga, or tattoos and henna suffice for cross-cultural appreciation and smooth race relations. By contrast, European civilization and its great books comprise the core of our education, at least at Columbia, which tries to inspire in us a love of high culture and a flight from barbarous pasts. America, after all, its culture and institutions derive from Europe, and English is our official language, some insist. And thus, occasions such as APAM and Black History and Latino Heritage Months are marginal to the dominant discourse, adding color and sound and sometimes frenzy, but never constituting America's essence, or so it seems. If a big wave come in, wrote Hawaiian scholar and historian David Malo in 1837, large and unfamiliar fishes will come from the dark ocean, and when they see the small fishes of the shallows, they will eat them up. Malo's warning and prophecy referred to the big wave of foreign invasion that would soon engulf the small fishes of the Hawaiian kingdom. The white man's ships have arrived with clever men from the big countries, he wrote. They know our people are few in number and our country is small. They will devour us. And consumed they were, the Hawaiians, by visitors and their diseases. They were ravaged. On the eve of British Captain James Cook's so-called discovery of Hawaii in 1778, about 5 years before Malo's birth, the Hawaiian population approached nearly 1 million people. By 1836, about the time of Malo's warning against large and unfamiliar fishes, the population had plummeted to just over 100,000. Whites controlled much of the economy of the kingdom, certainly external trade, and were rapidly gaining political influence and power. Born on the island of Hawaii, Malo grew up among royalty and in an environment that favored knowledge of Hawaiian history and culture, songs, or mele and dance, or hula, and preserved and transmitted traditions. He moved to Maui, entered a mission school as one of its first pupils, and became an avid reader of books in English and Hawaiian. Although ordained into the Christian ministry, Malo watched the demise of his people at the hand of Europeans and their missions with horror and acute pain. Before his death in 1853, Malo penned his classic work, Hawaiian Antiquities, that today stands as an invaluable and peerless record of Hawaiian history and culture set against their deliberate and willful destruction by Western civilization. David Malo, as his death approached, asked that his body be deposited on the summit of a mountain near Lahaina Luna, high above the rising tide of foreign invasion, he hoped. Malo's demise did not end his influence over history's course, as witnessed by today's resurgence of Hawaiian culture and language, in the drive for Hawaiian sovereignty, in the ascent of a people in resistance to the big wave from the dark ocean. Remember David Malo. In San Francisco, 1884, 8-year-old Mamie Tate, the daughter of Chinese migrants Joseph and Mary McGladrey Tate, was barred from the Spring Valley Primary School by its principal, Mary Hurley. Mamie's parents fought Principal Hurley's exclusion of their daughter, and the following year, the court ruled in favor of the Tapes, citing the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. To deny a child born of Chinese parents in this state entrance to the public schools, wrote the Superior Court judge, would be a violation of the law of the state and the Constitution of the United States. The Tape decision was affirmed by California's Supreme Court, but the legislature, in an attempt to circumvent the courts, passed a law that allowed school boards to establish separate schools for Asians. The 1885 Act declared, trustees shall have power to exclude children of filthy or vicious habits, children suffering from contagious or infectious diseases, and also to establish separate schools for children of Mongolian or Chinese descent. When such separate schools are established, Chinese or Mongolian children must not be admitted to any other schools. Note the equivalences: children of filthy or vicious habits with children suffering from contagious or infectious diseases with children of Asian descent. They were all the same: filth, disease, Asian. The law was praised by San Francisco's school superintendent as not a matter of race prejudice, but a question of the demoralization of one high race by a lower. But Mary Tape remained unconvinced that her daughter's exclusion from the public school was not a question of race prejudice. In a letter to the school board, dated April 8, 1885, Tape offered an eloquent protest against school segregation. "I see that you're going to make all sorts of excuses to keep my child out of the public schools," she wrote. "Dear sirs, will you please tell me, is it a disgrace to be born Chinese? Didn't God make us all? What right have you to bar my children out of school because she is a Chinese descent?" Tape concluded, "I will let the world see, sir, what justice there is when it is governed by race-prejudiced men, just because she is of Chinese descent, not because she don't dress like you, because she does, just because she is descent of Chinese parents. I guess she is more of an American than a good many of you who are going to prevent her education." In 1902, Chinese Americans sued in federal court, charging that school segregation was racist and that it violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. The court cited the separate but equal doctrine of the Supreme Court's 1896 Plessy v. Ferguson decision and rejected the challenge. But Mamie Tape and her parents would ultimately be proven right in the court's 1954 Brown v. Board of Education that separate was unequal and thereby showed that the claims for racial equality was more American than the counterclaims for racial privilege. Remember Mary McGladrey Tape. In Korea, Maria Wong left her husband to go to Hawaii because despite her objections, he had taken on a concubine. One day she defiantly announced to him, "I am no longer going to live with you. I'm going to take my 3 children to America to educate them. I shall become a wonderful woman." Wong signed a labor contract with the Hawaiian Sugar Planters Association and took her daughter, 2 sons, and sister-in-law to a sugar plantation on the island of Maui, where David Malo's remains lay buried high above the foreign tide. The women worked in the fields during the day and mended, ironed, and washed clothing at night, and on Sundays, saving for the children's education. One of her sons eventually earned a law degree, but was prevented from practicing law because he was not and could not become a U.S. citizen. Instead, he joined his mother picking grapes in California's vineyards and later became an herbalist. Maria Wong not only opposed Asian patriarchy, but also worked to liberate Korea from the oppression of Japanese colonialism. She headed the Korean Women's Relief Society of Hawaii, which raised money for the anti-colonial struggle, trained nurses for the war front, and undertook relief work among Koreans devastated by war and famine. Her daughter, Hai-Won Kim, was elected the first president of the Korean Women's Patriotic Society of California in 1919. 2 years later, the society connected national liberation with women's liberation. Sisters, stop dreaming in a family which is actually an invisible prison, exhorted the society's publication. Stand up, unshackle our next generations from traditional constraints. Our utmost tasks are to free ourselves of bondage, to build our wealth, to enlist as soldiers, and to obtain an education. If we are prepared, there will be no discrimination against us women in political participation. Recently, magazines have spoken about women's liberation. We should educate ourselves so that we can gain equality with men in the independence movement and be second to no one in responding to our national duty. Situating prominently the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in our historical narratives is a masculinist project. Women too built America. Maria Huang, by becoming a wonderful woman, offers an antidote to the poison of patriarchy, both within our culture and our intellectual discourse. By struggling to overthrow the yoke of colonialism and androcentrism, Maria Huang upheld the truth that all men and women are created equal and are endowed with inalienable rights. Remember Maria Huang. My parents were recruited to Hawaii as laborers sometime between 1920 and 1926, remembered Connie Tirona. It was a hard decision for my mother to go to Hawaii, coming from a very sheltered life. There were so few other Filipinas who ventured out to Hawaii's sugar plantations. Theirs was a hard life, Tirona said of her parents. They would work from very early in the morning till late at night. They would leave for work before the break of dawn and return long after dusk. The women, like my mother, would do the cooking, and some of them would go to work in the fields along with the men. After 5 years, her parents moved the family to California, where in Selma, near Fresno, Tirona was born. As migrant laborers, Tirona's family joined others following the changing seasons and crops up and down California's Central Valley. Vivid in her memory was a day in Watsonville where several white men on horseback rode into the labor camp, grabbed 2 Filipino men, tied them with ropes, and dragged them through the camp. They wanted to show the brown monkeys that they could not speak to white women, she recalled. I was horrified. I could not understand why people did such abominable things. It hurt me deeply to watch the Filipinos being beaten up. We were called brown monkeys. We were ignorant. We were savages. I just felt a sense of betrayal because my parents came to this country for the opportunity to improve their lifestyle, and they thought that Americans were kind people. Perhaps because of that hurt and sense of betrayal she experienced as a child, Tirona spoke out against injustices as an adult. After having married a Filipino-American Navy man, Tirona and her husband tried to buy a house in South San Francisco during the 1950s. A real estate agent was showing them a house when 2 white women called the agent over and began a spirited conversation, after which the agent returned to tell them that the house had just been sold. I was so angry and hurt, remembered Tirona, and I could see my husband's face. He really wanted us to live there. I have seen this look before. This happened to my father when I used to go with him to look for homes, and we always ended up on the other side of town. After a while, you sort of get these vibes about people. You just sense it. I was so angry. I felt that my husband had joined the service to fight for this country and that we had a right to buy homes there. So I told the real estate man, this house hasn't been sold. They saw me and they don't like my color. Tirona then marched over to the 2 women and said, you know, I don't want to live in a neighborhood where I'm going to have to deal with people like you. You can sell it to whomever you want, but there will be a day, she promised, when we can buy a house in any neighborhood. Tirona reflected upon her life as a Filipina and as a woman. Sometimes I'm not sure what it means to be an American, she began. I'm not equal to everyone. My color is different, and that has mattered all my life. I feel that not all Americans are equal. They're not. But for behaving like an American, by claiming the Constitution's promise of equality and justice, by demanding her rights under its guarantees, by affirming that she too was included within its preamble, we the people, Tirona expanded the definition of the term American and hastened the future when, in her words, we can buy a house in any neighborhood. Remember Connie Tirona. Har Dayal Singh arrived in the US from India in 1977. He told of the 1987 killing of Navroz Modi, an Asian Indian who was manager of Citicorp in Manhattan and who was beaten unconscious by a group of teenagers in Hoboken. Modi was only 30 years old when he died from that beating. 4 boys aged 16 to 18 were arrested in Modi's murder. We wanted them to be tried as adults, explains Singh. I called together our people in the community and we started the United Indian American Association. We arranged 5 different demonstrations to request that one of the underage boys involved be tried as an adult. They were going to treat the boy as a juvenile. I approached the authorities, asked the governor's office to recommend to the courts that they not treat him as a juvenile, but as an adult. When we demonstrated, the media covered it, and after that, the Attorney General's office agreed with us. Since we took this action, things are better. Before, they attacked Indians every day. They attacked over 20 different families. They broke into houses, Indian shops, and stores. They beat up on them. But now it is in control. Now there is less fear when we walk the streets. Before, I received many calls from people in my community every day. Now it's quiet. Because of this, I feel things are better. There is less hostility now. Singh worked as a security officer at a Jersey City medical center. I believe the people in this country are basically nice people, he declared. Because of this, our people like to settle in America. My daughter was born in this country, and when we met Michael Dukakis, nearby, in his election campaign for president in 1988, he asked her name, her age, and plans. She said, "I wish to become president of the United States." She said, "I am born American, but I am proud my parents are Indians." She's American, Singh explained. By birth, I am Indian. India is a great country. I have the same respect for this country. Legally, if we adopt this country, we should respect this country as we do our country. Still, you cannot ignore your birth country. When I came, my English was very poor. I had problems. I could not work. Now, things are better. And things are better because Singh helped to make America better by holding it to its best ideals, by organizing the Jersey City Asian Indian community, by demonstrating against racism and violence, by showing that being American didn't mean that you had to choose between India and America, Indian culture and American culture, but that you could be both Asian and American. There is no contradiction. The term American, he revealed, is generous and embraces a wide range of possibilities. Remember Har Dayal Singh. At a party in Coral Springs, Florida in August 1992, 19-year-old Luyan Phan Nguyen protested when some of the partygoers made racial slurs at him and some of his friends. Someone began shoving, and Nguyen and his friends tried to leave, but a mob of about 15 people chased him, yelling, "Chink, Viet Cong, I hate Vietnamese," according to witnesses. The mob caught Nguyen and, disregarding his pleas, beat and kicked him mercilessly. 2 days later, Nguyen died from bleeding in the brain. Nguyen had a 3.67 grade point average at the University of Miami, where he was a sophomore. He had migrated to Florida with his family in 1980 and had hoped to become a physician. Remember Luyan Phan Nguyen. David Malo, Mary McGladrey Tate, Maria Wang, Connie Tirona, Har Dayal Singh, Luyan Phan Nguyen. Their lives so quiet, so easy to miss. Their lives so common, so ordinary, so plain. Their lives so brief, so simple to dismiss. Yet on examination, they show a vastly different situation. David Malo, a people's survival. Mary McGladrey Tate, equality in education. Maria Wang, women's and national liberation. Connie Tirona, a voice against injustice. Har Dayal Singh, freedom from fear. Luyan Phan Nguyen, a cry for human dignity. No mean causes they, eminently worthy of commemoration, recognition, emulation, not merely for their sakes, but for us, all of us, for they punctuate, amplify, and secure the core ideals of this republic embraced by the American promise, the American creed, the American dream. Because all of us share a dream like David Malo for a people's right to exist, for a culture free from denigration and subordination. We share a dream like Mary McGladrey Tape for schools where children are judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. We share a dream like Maria Huang for a country freed from colonialism and for the chance to become a wonderful woman. We share a dream like Connie Tirona for the day when anyone can buy a house in any neighborhood. We share a dream like Har Dayal Singh for an America free from violence and hatred. We share a dream like Luyan Phan Nguyen, who raised his voice against racism and intimidation, bigotry and discrimination. He died for that dream. Their stories, you see, when told again and again in classroom after classroom from one generation to another, their stories keep the dream alive. Asian Pacific American history says, we are here. This is our place too. We belong. The bones of our ancestors lie in this soil, this land they secured from years of toil. Like too many of history's versions, Promontory Point's official photograph is a fraud, a sham, a fake. Look under the cover-up, the makeover, and see the Asian faces in that dusty and sweaty crowd. Asian women and men with their smug faces, their jubilant faces, their caught unawares faces. Look again, and you will see many others, white men to be sure, but also white women, African Americans, American Indians, Latinos, gays and lesbians, and many others, revealing the range of this nation's builders from sea to shining sea. So we demand, stay history's exclusionary hand, see our footprints in the sand. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Okahiro. At this time, there will be a question and answer session. So if you'd like to ask questions, please go up to any of the microphones around you. And
I know it's very difficult to stand up and go to the mic and talk. Come on.
Hi, how are you? My name is Mihan, and I say this humbly. I'm the new president of Asian Caucus on BC's campus for next year. My question is, you talk about the importance of remembering our history to reconfigure our future. How do we get our community to understand this importance, to understand the need to care, to do something?
A very good question. By our community, you mean America at large, Asia,
our APA
Pacific?
community.
Huh?
Our APA community?
APA, yeah. Well, I think there are several, many dimensions to that question. And one of it is that I think people in general are oftentimes uneducated about their own past. And I don't mean just APAs, and that what we get is generally from the schools that we go to, books that we read, or the news, and that oftentimes we just simply don't have the time or interest. I really am really impressed and also quite depressed by the kind of news that we get, for example, that disregards history. And the news doesn't have to record, write a whole book about a single event, but it needs to at least give some background to what brought this condition about. Because we oftentimes simply want sound bites that are just for the moment. And we don't remember what preceded that particular moment, which is so important and key to our understanding of our present condition. So I think that oftentimes, I don't think the blame needs to rest on APA communities alone, but to our oftentimes very nature of society and so forth. Now, I must tell you though, not everybody is in this condition, all right? I picked pineapples for 2 summers, and that was my membership in the working class. And I was so exhausted at the end of the day that all I wanted to do was lie down. I didn't even have energy to eat, just lie down and sleep, And I wondered how people who worked like that in the fields, my ancestors, my father and mother and grandparents, how they could have the energy to create, to write poetry, to compose music, to do all these other beautiful things that many people want to do, to express themselves, and yet just didn't have the time or energy. Now, mind you again, that was just my brief experience, in the working class, because working class people have done those kinds of things. But I think it takes extraordinary energy to educate ourselves and to be consciously aware of what preceded us. These stories that I told you, are just very simple stories, right? You wouldn't read this in a regular history book. And yet I think they're very important for us, all of us, meaning Americans, to remember and to commemorate, because I think their deeds are huge. Anyway, so the kinds of history or memories that we have then are oftentimes as important as we remembering something, because we need to remember also, I think, those things that are truly important. But thank you for asking the question. Good.
Hi. Is this on? Is it on? Hi, my name is Shen Chen, and I'm currently a senior. And I was just wondering if you could go into a little bit more detail about the Asian and Asian American feminist movement in America, and the current trends that you see for Asian women just in American society today.
Could you repeat? I didn't
Oh,
quite
okay.
hear.
Is this not on?
Yeah, you're fine. It's my ears.
Okay, the question is if you could elaborate a little bit more about the Asian and Asian American feminist movement in America and the current trends that you see for Asian American women today.
Yeah, wonderful. The founding figures in ethnic studies, Asian American studies, were heavily invested in a national project, meaning U.S., not Asia, U.S., and also in masculinity. And that Asian American women were there at the start. We're talking about 1968, 69, the institutionalization of Asian American studies, right? And also, it's very interesting to trace the trajectory of that feminism, which derives actually from a third world feminist consciousness, okay? And the third world feminist consciousness derives from various women's movements at the time, which was during the Vietnam War, among Vietnamese women, and also in China, especially. But also, interestingly, if you look at this Asian Women's Anthology, which was the first Asian American women's anthology produced here, they trace their origins also back to Pakistan and Iraq, right, as women's struggles, and the connection of their struggles in the US with those struggles in Asia. So that corrective I think, is so important for ethnic studies, which views its subject matter as simply race or principally race, because gender is implicated in race, and race is implicated in gender, along with sexuality, class, citizenship, our nation, and so forth. And our subject matter, thus, must be reconstituted into that full sort of complex agenda. So what I'm saying is that the feminist movements in Asia had an impact on the feminist movement in America, and that impact needs to still be taken fully into account within Asian American or Asian Pacific American studies. We have not yet fully reconceptualized our project that way. The other part of that is that European and white feminist theories in the US and from Europe are pivotal also to our understanding, of our condition, meaning the US. So I think many of us have learned a great deal from feminist theory, but not have it fully integrated because of the salience of race.
Thank you.
Thank you. More, come on. Yeah. Yeah.
Hi, my
Hi.
name is James. I'm a freshman at Boston College. My question, I'll preface it by saying, you commented on how one should be able to embrace both the country that you were born into and the country that you grew up in. And I totally agree with that. Yet you see this conflict that arises not just by generation with your parents or your grandparents. I'm guessing some of us or most of us are first generation Americans or second generation Americans. But you see that generational conflict between just values and interests, and you also see that among students of the same age some of them who grew up in a different country yet go to school here, and those who grew up all their lives in America. And I was wondering how, what your view was on this conflicting interest of those who attempt to preserve their nationality and their heritage, and those that are trying to buy into this new American culture.
Well, as you framed the question, it's quite a complicated issue. And I like to sort of turn it on its head because the general formulation within the U.S. is that immigrants come into this country and they assimilate into the mainstream. And that accounts then, within that construct, for generational differences and conflicts. So the first generations who migrate are old country and possibly cannot speak English and thus not fully integrated into America, whereas the second generation educated in the U.S. become more familiar and assimilated into the U.S. And there are very indices for that in terms of language capacity, who you intermarry with or marry, and so forth, you see. So that happens, true. But I think one can also turn it on its head by looking at it another way, and that is that why view it as an assimilation into the mainstream, and why not look at it from the point of view of the so-called home country also, right? That is, that these, say, Korean Americans also are Koreans, like in Korea, indicating that Korean culture and Korean American culture evolve and change in different situations, right? And so, like, while Korean Americans are moving into American culture, they're also indicating how Korean culture is changing in this context, right? So it's not simply a one-way process, it also refracts or goes back on the other culture, right? Now, for example, even more complicated, we have South Asians who might have moved to Africa, and then from Africa moved to the Caribbean, and the Caribbean moved to New York City or New Jersey. And there you have multiple sort of influences So are they South Asian, or are they, say, some kind of Caribbean, Trinidadian, or Guianan, or are they Ugandan, or Kenyan, or are they Indian? You know, now I would say that they're all that, you know, and that sort of complicates the circuits by which that culture moved or that thing moved. So in any case, to get back to your question, I think that those acculturation moves or processes are not simply one way, but they're multiply constituted, and I would hate to see one deemed authentic and the other one inauthentic or distant. Wait, there was somebody standing in this mic here. No? Okay.
I don't know, is there someone else?
No, don't defer. You're there.
I'm Chuan Bao. I'm a graduate student here in the Soc department, sociology, and I was wondering about how, especially since post-1965, the immigration laws changed and the privileging of the influx of immigrants with professional backgrounds and higher class backgrounds. I think that has that's shaped a generation of second generation or first generation Asian Americans who are kind of blindsided by the notion of class differences within the Asian American community. And so I was wondering, and then because so the class background of a lot of the East Asian and Asian Pacific Americans now is different, very different from what you were talking about historically at the construction of this nation. So I was wondering how you felt like, or how you think that we can kind of reconcile or understand the important class differences that we're often blinded by. Thank you.
A very good question, because in the, you know, in our histories and so forth, we generally view Asian migrants as workers, although that's not true, you know, and we also elide the fact that the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882 was directed at a group of people, but also at a class of people. You know, it was workers. Chinese workers were excluded, whereas government officials, students, and business people were still allowed in. So, like, yeah, we need to understand class as a very important dimension. What I'm saying is that in the past, because most of the migrants were of the working class, we tend to view Asian migrants as workers. Now today, as you pointed out, since 1965, after exclusion, we have largely a middle class, very educated group of people coming into this country from China, Korea, from Philippines, South Asia, and so forth. And thus we have also the reinforcement of the idea of a model minority, right, in which the educational and class standing of these Asians are much higher than in the past. But don't forget also, post-1965, we have a lot of Asian workers coming into this country, and poverty is still rife among those communities. So your question about taking into consideration the idea of class is exceedingly important and much underdeveloped in Asian American studies. And that's ironic because most of the founders in the field were in solidarity, at least conceptually, with working class and should have understood the positions of workers vis-a-vis the bourgeoisie or the capitalist classes, you know, and we have not. So there are very few, actually, studies about Asian American classes, the divisions within certain communities by not only gender, but also class. And we have even less work on sexuality, Asian American sexualities, and the diversity of it, and the meanings of it, and so forth. So we have a lot of work to do. And also, you know, the emphasis is on certain Asian ethnic groups and not others, you know. And no one raised the issue yet, but I will, about Pacific Islanders being put under the category Asian Pacific, you know, when a lot, that is also contested and fraught, because Pacific Islanders also see themselves as indigenous, as native peoples, and Asians as migrants into their homeland. So, it is a complicated category that was only made here in the US of A. You don't have this kind of category in Asia, for example. Anyway, there is an immense diversity. The immigration laws have channeled the migration and predetermined the shape of the community and the numbers in the community and the ages in the communities and so forth. So the immigration laws have been vital in that. But we also, in terms of our studies, need to take into account those full ranges of complexities. Yeah. So thank you for your question.
This will be the last question.
Sorry.
Hi, my name is Gabriella. Thank you for coming. I'm Filipino American from suburban New York, and I just wanted to know how you came about coming to your own Asian American consciousness, because I feel that as a middle class Asian American, it took me a long time to sort of recognize that I was the only Asian American with my white group of friends, and there were some black kids over here, and I didn't know what race relations were until I got to college. So I wondered where you came from and how you got to where you are today.
So your question was directed at me, how I came to my consciousness? Because you told your background. Okay. Yeah. I must. I was born in Hawaii, on a sugar plantation, sugar plantation on the island of Oahu, and people think of Hawaii as a racial paradise. You see a rainbow in Hawaii often. All the different colors, right? Yeah, that's the analogy anyway. But in Hawaii also, there is that, but there's also quite a bit of tensions and also conflicts while there's cooperation. And the plantation structure emphasized that, made it easy to have tensions among different groups because workers were recruited and housed and paid differentially by groups, right? So it would be a tactic by which to pit one group against another. So when I lived with mainly Japanese, although there were a few Chinese there, and then we knew the Filipinos were right at the bottom, where all the shit flowed, literally. You know what I mean? So the cooler elevations were reserved for the people who had moved up a little bit, and then the bad places were reserved for the more recent ones, all right? And so we got an early education in that, whereas the bosses lived way up high, where there is cool and nice views and so forth, right? So my grandfather worked on one of those, he was called a yard boy, even though he was an older man, for this place that it looked like a southern plantation to my mind. It was this huge white house with these pillars in the front, mango trees and a spacious lawn, and maids' quarters in the back, And so I early developed a consciousness about class distinctions and also race, since they seemed to conform with class in Hawaii, At the same time, I was kind of colorblind too, because when I went to school, I used to read these New England readers, about our history, about how my ancestors, the Pilgrims, landed here, And how they, learned from the Indians how to hunt turkey, and some, drank wild turkey. But in any case, so I thought of myself like a New Englander, And I was growing up in Hawaii. I was sweltering, reading these books, and thinking about fall and winter and going to grandma's house and these. So like, I had that kind of historic consciousness. Yeah. Now, it shocked me too when people said, hey, you're different. You're somebody else, You're not us. Well, that came as a shock too. I remember going to college in California. That was the first time I lived away from Hawaii. And I went to this barbershop to get my hair cut. And the guy said, man, your hair is so thick or coarse that you're making my scissors dull, And I thought, wow. I never went back again, I cut my own hair and my friends cut my hair. I mean, like, hey, who needs that? Actually, I was in Beaufort, South Carolina. And this guy went into this barber shop, and he was sharpening his razor, this open blade razor, and he was saying, them damn gooks, because it was Vietnam War, damn gooks, and I thought, whoa, man, that's a little too close. Anyway, so, yeah, you have these different experiences, and then you become, wait a minute, am I? Actually, I had a Haole classmate. Haole is white, okay, in high school. And she said, you look like Rick Nelson to me. You know who Rick Nelson was? Ozzie and Harriet, the really handsome kid who played guitar, and he was, huh? She said, you look like Rick Nelson. I said, wow. So we can delude ourselves, Hey, that's the end, right? Thank you.